by way of an introduction, of course, I'm not divulging any secrets here if I say that we now live in an era of increased environmental awareness, but also of controversy. The debates around climate change, which are probably the ones that are the most public ones. These debates show that on the one hand, the fragility of life on Earth and of the ecosystems that enable our human existence on this planet has been cast into sharp relief. But they also highlight that, on the other hand, there is widespread denial that the crisis already actually exists. And in some cases, as we all know, this denial has reached the commanding heights of politics. Of course, evidence in the United States under the Trump presidency, evidence in Brazil under President Bolsonaro, but also, for example, in Australia, when the Climate Commission was dissolved by the newly elected government of Tony Abbott in 2013. So there are probably instances that we don't look at with the same scrutiny that we devoted to Trump or Bolsonaro. Elsewhere, on the other hand, again, on an international scale, politicians have committed themselves to change and have entered international treaties, famously, of course, the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. But the political processes often appear slow and time-consuming. At the other end of the spectrum, the above-mentioned awareness, environmental awareness, has led many people to ask what they can do to live a healthier and more environment-friendly, you might want to say, more sustainable lifestyle. And therefore, the crisis and the responses to it not only impact the higher aggregate levels of politics, society, the economy, you might want to add culture to this mix. So not only the aggregate level, but also the individual level. Now, in order to capture the magnitude of the change and potentially also in order to elicit responses to it, the concept of the Anthropocene has been introduced across a wide range of academic disciplines. My hunch is that it's not so present in the realm of public discussion, but certainly in an academic environment, it is now a widely used concept. In the words of the Australian-based American chemist Will Steffen, the Anthropocene can be defined as a period in which, and I quote him here, the human imprint on the global environment has become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth system. Yeah, so that human activity, the human imprint, is one of the factors that impact most profoundly on the Earth system. In this broad definition, the Anthropocene, the concept of the Anthropocene has been picked up not only in the earth sciences and other natural sciences, but also in the humanities, and to a degree, I would also think in the social sciences. What I'm not exactly sure about is whether both sides mean the same thing when they talk about it. So this might be one of the areas that we want to devote some attention to today when scientists and people in the humanities talk about the Anthropocene. Are they essentially talking about the same thing? So that, not least owing to its interdisciplinary use, the Anthropocene raises important conceptual and practical questions that are closely entwined with the overarching theme of our annual IAS theme, namely time. So time plays a key role, of course, when we talk about the Anthropocene, and it does so in a number of ways, which we will try to explore. Questions, for example, are: how do we define a new epoch? And what does it mean for us, both as individuals and as members of social collectives, to inhabit this new epoch? So these are some of the questions that we're going to discuss in what time we have left now, roughly 2¼ hours. Marcia has already briefly introduced our 3 discussants today. I will move into introducing them in a bit more detail. Beginning with our fellow who is joining us from afar. We will do this in in order of geographical distance. This is Liz Chatterjee, who is an assistant professor of environmental history at the University of Chicago. She is a historian of energy and the environment, and she's also a particular geographical focus. She's a South Asianist focusing on India from 1900 to the present. And her research explores how non-Western energy histories disrupt conventional understandings of capitalist development. That's certainly something we will be talking about later on. How it disrupts conventional understandings of capitalist development, the social dynamics of climate change, and green political thought. Just wanted to mention her first book manuscript. I'm not sure whether it is out already. It is? No, it's not. Okay. Electric Democracy, which traces the flows of electricity to provide an energy-centered history of India's transforming political economy since 1947, the year of independence. And I know she's working on another project where she tries to locate politically environmental movements and tries to situate them differently to what we normally assume that they are leftist movements, and she shows that this is not always the case. I move much closer to home, just a half an hour's drive away from where we are now. Professor Mark Williams is a professor of palaeobiology at the University of Leicester. He's been a scientist with the British Geological and British Antarctic Surveys. He's interested in the evolution of life and especially in its current trajectory of change in the Anthropocene. He's worked on this topic for a long, long time, and he's also importantly a long-time member of the Anthropocene working group too, which we might talk about in a bit more detail later on. I think there is so much to say about his output, his academic output, that I think I would probably not be able to end. So I will leave it there. And move through our third fellow, who is from within Loughborough University. This is Joanna Boehnert, a lecturer in design and the creative industries. She founded Ecolabs in London as a design research studio, which engaged with the visual communication of complex environmental problems. And I think this is one of the things that she's really interested in communicating issues around the environment, including, I think, around the Anthropocene, to a larger public. And she has done research on mapping climate communication, for example, as a visiting fellow at the University of Colorado. And she's written a book, a short, slim book, A Design Ecology Politics Toward the Ecocene. And I think I can really leave it there. And I do want to move into the discussion, but let me, before we do that, give you an idea of what's actually going to happen in what follows after my introduction. I should also mention maybe, I think they have all been mentioned, Peter Kowalek, Alex Agoskin, Ariana Majoran. You'll all see them on screen, my distinguished colleagues and fellow organizers of the annual theme on time, so that you know us all now, and we can move on to the content part. So what is going to happen? Now, we don't have formalized papers. This whole event will take the form of a panel discussion, which I will moderate. And we have 4 thematic blocks mapped against 2 time slots, as it were. And the 4 thematic blocks are that we will first look at the Anthropocene as a concept, especially in relation to how different disciplines conceptualize time and define periods of time. Secondly, we will look at the past. In other words, we will look at when the Anthropocene actually began, when did this new epoch actually kick in, and what factors impacted its evolution, and how probably does it relate to other periods that we generally deal with certainly in the humanities, but possibly also beyond. The third section will then take a look at the present situation. When we live in the Anthropocene, what does that practically mean, both at the collective level, but also at the individual level. And then these three sections will form the first slot. So we'll probably conclude around 4:15 p.m. and then give you a bit of a break of about 15 minutes. And then after this, we will tackle the fourth section, in which we will try to map out possible directions for the future. This will take roughly half an hour. That's at least the time we have allocated for it. But then we will gradually open the floor to the audience for a general discussion, so that we will hopefully have at least half an hour where you guys can join in, where the people who are now panelists and the ones that you see on the screen can discuss things more broadly, but also where those of you who are communicating through the chat will have the opportunity to ask specific questions, and Ariana, who is very experienced in monitoring chats, will pick them up and will feed them into the discussion. That is the basic idea. This is how we are going to work. And to conclude this short introduction, just let me say that I'm looking forward to moderating the discussion, and I wish us all a productive and fruitful time that we're going to spend together. Okay, so let's then look at the our first thematic block, which is to look at the Anthropocene as an epoch. So in its relation to periodization, what does the Anthropocene mean as a concept in various academic disciplines? And what I wanted to start out with is, because we have people with various academic backgrounds, to look at how this concept of the Anthropocene has evolved within their disciplines. And maybe it would be a good point and a good idea to start really with Mark, because the earth sciences, broadly speaking, is where the concept as we use it today originated around the year 2000. So if you could tell us a little bit about the origins of the concept, why was it introduced, and how have geologists, palaeobiologists, and other people in earth sciences picked it up?
Thank you, Torelf. So the concept of the Anthropocene, I guess, has a long history. Really, ideas about humans as being fundamental influences on the planet goes back to the 19th century, perhaps even before then. I guess the concept of the Anthropocene, as it's currently being developed and understood, was very much originally a concept of the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, who initiated this word Anthropocene at a meeting of the International Geosphere Biosphere Programme in 2000, because he was frustrated with the discussions in the room that were still had a very strong Holocene focus, and Paul Crutzen thought that in fact humans were such considerable agents of change that we needed a new term, that in fact we transitioned into a new geological epoch of time, and he coined the term Anthropocene. Independently of Paul Crutzen, Eugene Stormer, a person who worked on diatoms and lakes, had also invented this term Anthropocene and had a similar kind of concept. So the two of them wrote the first kind of paper on this at the beginning of this century. It was about 6 years later, I think, that the geologists first picked up on this, and it was very much my good friend Jan Zalazevich. We were part of a commission, a stratigraphy commission of the Geological Society, and as a group we examined the idea from a geological perspective. It had found its way onto the internet. I think lots of different disciplines were already using it, but it didn't have any kind of formal geological definition. So the Stratigraphy Commission of the Geological Society of London examined it. We thought it had legs. We thought that we could recognise a clear evidence of humanity's impact on the planet in the geological record. And as a result of that, we wrote a paper, first paper, I guess, in this field from a geological perspective, which we published in GSA Bulletin in 2008. And that really then beget the Anthropocene Working Group as a working group of the Quaternary Subcommission in the International Commission on Stratigraphy. to try and examine this concept to see if, in fact, as a group of geologists within this working group, and also the working group includes quite a wide range of different disciplines. We have an international lawyer in there, in Deasl, we have archaeologists. So it's good that we have a kind of multidisciplinary approach to this. But what we're trying to do is actually look at the physical record in lakes, in seas, and seeing if we can actually recognize that physical impact of humans on the planet to define a point in time in the stratigraphy of this planet whereby we can acknowledge that humans are now the major influencers on the planet. So that, in a nutshell, really is what we've been doing since 2009, when that Anthropocene working group was put together. We're looking at several sites around the planet in a whole range of different settings, from Antarctic ice to San Francisco Bay to lakes in Canada and China, to see if we can recognize the signal of the Anthropocene and, importantly, enable us to correlate that level across the planet to a particular and very specific time plane that we can talk about in a bit more detail if you'd like, Toralf, in due course.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sure we certainly will get to that point. I want to continue with Liz, and I think one of the things that really fascinated me about the Anthropocene was the way that this was regenerated in the context that Mark's just described, but then humanities scholars, historians, and others were very keen to pick that up. And I was wondering, why do you think, what sparked that interest in humanities disciplines in the Anthropocene, and how did that interest then kind of evolve and generate academic output, scholarly output?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak particularly for history. And the first thing to say is that definitely not all historians have got on this Anthropocene bandwagon at all. Plenty of historians say are very hostile to the idea of a sort of before and after, you know, given that history is all about tracking change and continuities over time, and also see this as a sort of reheating of a kind of Enlightenment set of narratives where we are only interested in the past in order to kind of track the trajectory of where we've got to. But as you say, lots of people, including me, find this an enormously generative concept. I think for history in particular, it's an enormous and quite thrilling challenge posed by people like Mark and geologists more broadly, that makes us realize, in the words of my colleague Deepesh Chakrabarty, that we as humans can't be the protagonist of the Earth's history. We simply come too late in the story for that to be the case. So it forces upon us, I think, a new sense of temporal scale. That means we have to start integrating in a much more, with great humility, realizing humans aren't central to the story often, that we have to integrate this much bigger set of time frames, both in geological time and as well in evolutionary time, into our more typical understanding of human history. I think that's hugely exciting. The second way I think that it pushes us, and this is something that the humanities have really taken and run with a little bit, perpendicular, if you like, from the stratigraphical debates, is to make us rethink spatial scales as well, in ways that really dissolve this notion that there is something special and distinctive about humans as opposed to the rest of nature. So we have to think about writing histories that can go to the very big, the Earth systems, but all the way down to, say, the microbial. I mean, COVID has made us realize just how porous the human bodies are, for example, and as well to realize that humans exist on this spectrum, a continuum of different forms of life. And I spotted Donna Haraway being mentioned in the chat. You know, this is one way this has really gone, is talking about multi-species assemblages and interactions and so on. So the temporal scale and this spatial scale both decenter the human in really interesting ways. I'd just say as well, third and finally, one of the most interesting things that I find the concept pushes us to do is to really rethink this relationship between past, present, and future. I mean, we're going to go and talk about the future in a bit. What has been called, if you like, Enlightenment or modernist ideas of how history is told sort of see a linear relationship between past, present, future. We're going along on this progressive trajectory. And, you know, the high noon is roughly the period, say, from the French Revolution to maybe the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think we're all already jaded about that even before the Anthropocene came along, this idea of progressive improvement. Or aiming towards a better society, you know, and I think postmodernism raised a whole set of challenges to that. But what the Anthropocene does that I think is very different is saying, if these really genuinely are unprecedented changes, then how do we think about the relationship between past, present, and future? If for the first time we are genuinely looking at a world where, as again mentioned in the chat, there's an existential threat to human society, if not humans as a species, this looks really different. The whole of written human history occurs in this period of climactic relative stability called the Holocene, and now we're leaving it. And I think it forces us to rethink, well, what is the purpose of history? If all of our history, human history, is about this particular set, or it was predicated on this set of conditions that we're exiting, does history actually have anything to teach us anymore? I would say it does, but it is an interesting set of really fundamental questions, I think, for the discipline. So the kind of temporal scale, the decentering of the human, and this moving from the Earth system right down to the micro scale, and I think the question of what is this relationship with the future? Is it something totally new? How do we conceptualize that? All of these things, I think, humanities have taken in 100 really exciting dimensions. Just one final point. I don't think that we're ever going to agree in the same way as the Anthropocene working group, you know, that stratigraphers may come up with a single line of argument. But to me, that's fine. I mean, humanities are a fundamentally pluralist enterprise. And I think, you know, Mark's recent book on the Anthropocene, it is couched as multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary. I think to capture, and you know, I don't want to mansplain Mark's book, but I think to try and capture the fact that there is a great virtue to this pluralism as well. We don't necessarily all need to be on precisely the same track when it comes to dates and so on. It's partly these 100 different directions that are the really exciting thing about the Anthropocene.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Joanna, I think with you, I think it's very, very easy to anchor Mark and Liz in a discipline. I think you have a much broader background and also are kind of in a way situated in between academic disciplines. But from your perspective, you know, the fields that you have touched on or that you've engaged with, what would you say? What is the value of the Anthropocene as a concept from where you are coming from?
All right, can you hear me? Yes, so Liz says that the Anthropocene concept hasn't been accepted in history, and I would say that that's even more so in the field where I am normally working now. I'm currently situated in a design school. My book is taught in design theory, and so it is very much a concept that needs to be embedded across the various disciplines. And it seems to me like it was a concept created by physical sciences in order to make that leap, because we had this sort of very big set of global challenges that science can't address on its own. And so it's a concept that is a fundamental sort of, it represents all of these multitude of fundamental challenges, and it's a reframing that has quite serious implications for, especially for disciplines like design, and it's disruptive, and so while there's been sustainable design for 30 years now, the Anthropocene concept is still very unestablished, and it's interesting where it is, where sustainability is evident in design and the various design disciplines. You'll see it much more, it's much more evident where the impact is more easily quantifiable. Say architecture, that's where my work, for example, I get quite a lot of invitations to architecture schools, more so than I do in my actual particular discipline, because it's much harder to prove how communication design what role communication design has to play in this whole transition, social transition. But what I do is, what I'd argue that actually communication design is fundamental in changing people's helping people change the way that we think about the world and the things we want to do. But it's very much harder to make a concept like the Anthropocene stick in that context, because you'll see, so like I said, you have architecture, it's much more, sustainability theory is much more advanced in architecture. It's, common, and all students have it throughout their undergraduate, graduate education mostly. Product design, not as solidly as architecture, but it's there. And then other places, it's harder to make the argument, or it hasn't really embedded itself as well. And I think that's the sort of abstractness of the relationship, and it is like, it will, but it does need to, and the difficulty of making that argument of how it will change. Not only, it's not just a technocratic challenge, but one that will require quite different sets of values. So within design, you have a very different sort of just what constitutes good design will be challenged. So it's no longer, I think you said just that you were talking, Liz, about the human-centered, but in some disciplines we have the consumer-centered sort of mode of approaching our problems, and there's a certain logic that determines how the world is designed and how people live their lives within the worlds that are designed for them. And so if we want to really focus on the kinds of priorities that the Anthropocene demands, those sorts of imperatives, climate change, all the other planetary boundaries, then that really changes how designers will have to approach their discipline and their practice. And so I think that it demands this very sort of interdisciplinary conversation like we're having now, and things like history are very helpful because they can it helps us understand the context of how transitions work socially, and how, through looking at historically, I'm sure we're going to talk about that more today, is the processes that have worked historically for transitions and those that haven't. Maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think what we've already seen is that indeed when we talk about the Anthropocene, we're talking about two things. We're talking about conceptual approaches. How do we actually, define an epoch? But then, as I probably said earlier already, it's also, we inhabit this epoch, right? So, it raises those questions, those practical questions that Joanna has raised, but also, in a sense, Liz, what you said about, there being past, present, and future, and they're being reconfigured through the concept of the Anthropocene. And I think this is indeed what we need to talk about. I would want to take one step back, though, from Joanna and maybe revisit some of the points that Mark and Liz have made. Namely about how we actually, in our disciplines define periods. How do we actually periodize? And just spend a few minutes on that. And I realized that I haven't really properly introduced myself, but I'm a historian, as it happens, on modern Chinese and global history. So I want to start really with Liz this time, and in a way ask, as one historian to another, when we historians always have to try to work with periods. I think we need that in order to, as a heuristic means, to make sense of the past. But I think we are also aware that the periods that we construe are inherently problematic, and you can take any period you like. They're all raising problems, and so I'm wondering, with that in mind, how then do we make sense of this new period? How do we properly define it? And especially, and I think it's a question that I want to ask Mark in a similar way, slightly different way, how do we balance our need to periodize against the idea that time is actually a continuum? So where does the Anthropocene sit within that?
Yeah, you're completely right. We're a discipline that can't agree on what a century is. So clearly we would struggle with this. I think it's a really interesting question, because at the heart of this is, what is the core of the novelty of the Anthropocene? That would be the question that a historian might ask. And in some ways, then, that is a return to much older questions about modernity, about whether there is something, the huge historiography, say, on the Industrial Revolution, its antecedents, the idea of, precursors like the Industrious Revolution, when this takes off all around the world. I think these are all relevant debates for how we think about the Anthropocene. In some sense, for a historian, the Anthropocene will always be a Rorschach test, where we see exactly what we work on in it and argue that that's the core part. So for me, of course, it's going to be about energy, and and I would foreground the experiences of Asia. But let me explain a little bit why I favor this kind of dating. So Mark mentioned Paul Crutzen initially proposing this, and really centering the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the first James Watt's patent on the steam engine in 1784 as a putative start date. And I think that there's been a lot of pushback against that. And I would also push back against it by saying, I don't think it's as simple as using fossil fuels explains where we get to. A historian, and you're a historian of China, Thorolf, you would say the Chinese have been burning coal since probably the 3rd century BC, have had deforestation crises for more than a millennia and so on. London was a big coal consumer, say, well before the Industrial Revolution. So there's nothing new about fossil fuels per se, although I think the emergence of the steam engine is interesting. For me, what is the really momentous transformation we do get, and this is where I would see the pivot, is the emergence of these large technological systems that mean that we not just scale up the extraction of fossil fuels and all sorts of other natural resources, but also these large technological systems, I'd say, take on a bit of a momentum of their own. So I'm thinking, say, of the electricity grid, oil pipelines, but we might also think of, say, modern industrial food systems as well. Given that the Anthropocene is more than climate change, it's also about, say, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and so on, that are embroiled with the use of chemical synthetic fertilizers, the Haber-Bosch process, and so on. So that's what I would look to as the core of this pivot, is the emergence of these large technological systems as something really wholly new. This is what the geoscientist Peter Haff has called the idea of a technosphere. So we're more used to the concept of the biosphere, but the technosphere being a kind of human-created technological set of interlocking systems that gain a kind of autonomy of their own. For me, this is one of the key things about why we should think of this as a move into a new period, is this inertia, this irreversibility. And that's what I'm interested to look at, is how we not just see some transitions happening, but how those transitions actually become consolidated and locked in. So I would focus on those systems, and that would give us different dates around the world. You know, from, say, the 1880s, 1890s in the US with the development of electric utilities, but much later in other areas of the world. I mean, we can return to this question if you like, but I know stratigraphers increasingly are focusing on the so-called period of the Great Acceleration, this huge uptick we see in basically every socioeconomic indicator on one side and environmental indicator on the other. Population, you know, economic growth, and so on, around 1945. And similarly, the number of big dams, you know, emissions, on and on, freshwater usage, all around 1945. Increasingly in my work, I think that we might be looking at two great accelerations, because I think it's very real in the rich West. We see this huge uptick around 1945, the so-called Trente Glorieuses, the golden age of abundance that we see in post-war Europe and the US, Japan, and so on, maybe a little bit the Soviet Union. But we start seeing economic stagnation, the oil shocks and everything around about 1973. And we actually see a plateauing, we see a energy intensity diminish, and the birth of a global environmental movement in the West. This is almost exactly the same time, though, that I'd say the buck passes over to India and China. So I almost think that we can see two separate trajectories of acceleration there that kind of align with the spread of those big infrastructural systems in the rest of the world. But that's a little bit how I would approach the question, is trying to work out what is the novelty, but what also means that this is something that's locked in, because why talk about an entirely new epoch if it's something that's going to last only 10 years and we can potter back merrily to the Holocene? To me, it's exactly about these questions of inertia. And it does raise all sorts of provocative questions for global historians like us about how the experiences of different countries and so on fits into these narratives. It's going to be messy, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've already moved quite a bit into really looking at, you know, the section that I titled The Past, where we're not just looking at the concept, but really at you know, the facts that we know and how we can, or how our concept of the Anthropocene kind of teases out certain, you know, what you call trajectories in human development that are connected with, you know, how we live today and potentially also how we're going to live in the future. I just want to take one step back and come to Mark, because I agree with Liz completely that, I mean, we can make up periods as historians. We have a great liberty in how we periodize. There's also, of course, the problem of most of the periods that we use are highly Eurocentric. They don't not necessarily apply to cultures such as India or China or elsewhere outside Europe. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. But I do think, because I don't know, you know, who is in the audience and what the knowledge is, I think it would be interesting to see, you know, where you are coming from in geology. You have far more kind of clearly defined, established processes of how a new epoch is actually agreed upon, and you have very different mechanisms. And maybe you can talk about this a little bit, and then I will come back, I think, again, starting with you on the question of, where do things originate?
Thank you, Toril. So I think it's an interesting point about the way in which different disciplines look at periods of time. And I think I need to explain a little bit, perhaps to everybody here, about the way that geologists do this and the reasons why we have such strict formal processes for defining time. And really fundamentally, that's because we're also historians, but we're dealing with 4.5 billion years of Earth history. And as you go back in time, the record that we have, the physical record, gets more and more piecemeal. The further back, the less information we have. And that often makes it very, very difficult, therefore, for us to work out what's going on in one part of the Earth and correlate it to another part of the Earth. And that's why we need this chronostratigraphic framework that defines these surfaces in the geological record that we recognize as being of equivalent time everywhere. So I can give you an illustration of why that's so important to us. So much of the modeling work, which is done in deep time to try to understand how the climate of the near future might manifest, focuses on particular time periods. So the mid-Pliocene is one of them, for example, because it's a world in which we know atmospheric CO2 was probably very similar to the level it is at present. So therefore a good potential scenario for us to compare with. Now, if you're trying to reconstruct the climate of the Pliocene and you want to underpin that with geological data, and you're back 3 million years, you've got to be absolutely certain that what you recognize as being proxies for climate in North America are exactly the same in terms of their time frame as a proxy that you might be looking at from Indonesia or Australia. That's important because, of course, the climate system of planet Earth is teleconnected in many different ways. And if you're going to interpret the climate in the past to use it as a proxy for the future, you've got to be certain that what you're correlating in one place correlates to another place. So geologists also see the Earth as a continuum. We see a whole series of events manifesting over long periods of time. They're complex. They sometimes go backwards. So it's not a kind of linear. Liz has already talked about this in terms of the kind of linear way in which many disciplines interpreted the patterns of history and also of life on Earth. And that was certainly a component of my discipline as well 2 or 3 decades ago. But because dealing with these complex interconnected processes that unfold over long periods of time, we as geologists have to have a framework that we can hang all of this complexity on. If we didn't have that framework, then we would have absolute chaos when we tried to interpret how the Earth had evolved over a long period of time. And that's why we try to define these chronostratigraphic intervals in the geological record. So what we do is we would have a global analysis. This is what the Anthropocene working group is doing at the moment, but it would be the same if you were looking in the Silurian 430 million years ago, or even deep in the Precambrian 600 million years ago. You have a working group of scientists who go out, they look at the physical record, and they look for markers which enable us to define one of these surfaces of equivalent time everywhere. The most famous of these in the geological record would be the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. It's the time when a massive asteroid hit the planet in the Gulf of Mexico, and the repercussions of that went waves across the planet within a few hours, causing mass extinction and a whole change to the Earth system. So that's a really good isochronous surface that we can recognize everywhere, and it allows us a framework that we can interpret the processes that led up to that asteroid strike and what happened afterwards as part of one of these time continuums. Now, in our Anthropocene context, of course, this is very different because we have historical records, we have archaeological records, and you could say to me, why are the geologists trying to define a boundary in 1950? Because I could go to a historical record or I could look at a newspaper from that time and know what's going on in the world. And of course, that's absolutely true. But from our disciplinary perspective, we have to be able to define these isochronous surfaces. And we have to be able to identify a marker or markers that allow us to correlate exactly the same time frame, be we working in a sedimentary succession in China, or in North America, or in South America, or or in the Antarctic, or in the deep ocean, because that's the framework which allows us to understand and connect the processes before and the processes afterwards also, of course. And I think we're going to come to that a little bit later in the discussion, as Toralf has already alluded to. So that's the reason that geologists try to define these isochronous surfaces. And even in a historical context, we still need to be able to do that if we're going to use that as a marker of what Liz has already talked about, of these very, very fundamental changes that humans have made to the Earth system, most notably in the 20th and early 21st century. And I'm sure, again, we're going to talk about just how fundamental those changes are as we go through this discussion. That's why we need to do this. And that's what we're doing as a group. And we hope to be able to define that boundary. We thought we'd be able to do it next year, but we think because of COVID, it'll probably be 2023, but in the next couple of years or so. And we can do that. We can recognize it very clearly. We can talk about that too. So.
Okay, I think one of the really interesting aspects that have come out for me so far is this kind of asynchronicity that Liz has mentioned, that you've got different trajectories, different speeds, different times where these things kick in different parts of the world. And in a way, what I also found interesting, if I understood you correctly, Mark, and this is my follow-up question now for you, is that, I mean, although you are a geologist and you are talking about 4.5 billion years, and as historians would probably talk about 10,000 years, you have a much more conservative, if I may say that, or a much more recent boundary in mind when you talk about the Anthropocene. Am I understanding you correctly? And why is that? I mean, Liz, I think you started with James Watt and the steam engine in 1784 as one of the possible dates you're contemplating. I think you said around 1950. What leads you to that date around 1950?
So as a geologist and as an Anthropocene working group, we examine the entirety of human history. And of course that goes back 2.8 million years in itself, to the earliest representatives of our genus, of the genus Homo. So we've got a skeletal record and we've got an artifact record, and that goes back a long way. And then of course we can find, as we go through time, changes to the Earth system as a result of humans. I want to kind of get away from the kind of linear kind of directionality here, but of course, you can see increasing influence of humans on the planet as you go forward in time, as we develop intellectually, and as we develop culturally, and as we develop technologically. And so if you look in the fossil record from 50,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, you can see that increasing influence in the way in which we interact with the large mammals around us, and how we actually influenced a widespread extinction across the planet. You can look at many other components of this. You could then look at the development of agriculture, of course. It develops in many different places at many different times, but certainly from around about 12,000 years ago, it's developing in the Levant and in the Fertile Crescent, not long after in Mesoamerica and in China and in other places. So that leaves a physical fossil record, just as those mammal extinctions have left, just as the skeletal and the artifactual evidence of humans has left. There are lots of these potential time intervals that you can look at from the perspective of human influence on the planet. We could come forward in time and think about globalization. In the early modern period, for example, the Columbian Exchange has been suggested as a potential place to think about an Anthropocene boundary. All of these are very, very significant events. They're part of this continuum of change as a result of human impact on the planet. However, for me, as a geologist, what matters is my ability to be able to define this isochronous surface. So although all of these events are incredibly significant, a big extinction of mammals 10,000 years ago, the development of agriculture, civilization, of urbanization, of writing, all of these things clearly are very, very significant in terms of the evolution of the planet and of human interactions with the planet. What I need is something in the geological record that allows me to correlate globally, to give me my framework that enables me to relate how all of these processes have gone on before and what might happen going forward. And it's only really in the 20th century that I can do that. 20th for us? Do you want me to talk a little bit about some of those ways we would do that,
yeah, let's spend maybe, let's spend maybe 2-3 minutes on that, and then we need to get to, because I'm mindful of time, we need to get to the present as well. I think we're now talking about the histories, but we need to get to the present situation. So maybe finish 20 past, Marsha? 20 past, have a structure like shorter break. Brilliant. Okay, so
I can do this very quickly, and I can give you a couple of really good examples. So the Columbian Exchange is clearly a very, very significant event in terms of the way that humans and cultures were interconnected, and how some cultures were decimated, of course, as a result of that. And there is a definite paleontological signal of that. So I can find maize pollen in African lakes, for example, from the early 18th century, which is part of that Columbian Exchange. However, all of the markers of that Columbian Exchange, like the maize pollen, for example, lots of other cultivated crops that were exchanged, give me a signal which is time transgressive. That means they do not pin down a precise horizon that I can recognize everywhere on the planet as being of equivalent time. And the time when I can do that as a geologist, and when we as a working group can do that, is really from the 20th century and in the mid 20th century. Now, I'll give you another biological example because I'm a paleontologist. As a result of globalization in the 20th century and the interchange of goods across the planet and the shipping and the transport networks that enable that interconnectivity, I start to see a very clear signal in the geological record of species which are being translocated. Species which have been translocated very, very rapidly, and which leave me a paleontological signal that I can correlate globally. So I could correlate from San Francisco Bay across the USA. In fact, I've got a PhD student, Stephen Himpson, doing that at this very moment. And then I could correlate back into Europe, and I can correlate across the world. I can correlate precise time frames because of this sudden, rapid acceleration in the way in which species are being exchanged across the planet. Now, that's important stratigraphically, but of course, and Liz has already alluded to this, and Joanna's already alluded to this, it's also very important in terms of giving us a record of the processes that have led to a fundamental restructuring of the biosphere on this planet. So everything, if you like, comes together in that 20th century interval.
Okay. Thank you. I think I want to put the next question to Liz, and it's in a way, I think I tried to pack as much into this question as I possibly can. I think one of the interesting debates that I'm aware of is, of course, to what extent is the Anthropocene the process of specific, let's say, socioeconomic formations. In other words, should we be speaking of a Capitalocene rather than an Anthropocene? And as I know that you have worked in this area, and this is one of the things that you've been interested in and done research on, I was wondering whether we can talk about this a little bit. So how important is capitalism as a socioeconomic formation in the rise of the Anthropocene? Can we think of other factors? You have already mentioned that the Anthropocene kicks in different parts of the world at different times. So how can we account for that? And finally, what role did forms of global inequality and domination, for example, imperialism/colonialism or neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism play in this process? That's a lot packed into one question, but I think in a way they're all connected. All these phenomena are connected. Capitalism is a driver behind a lot of these processes of European domination of the world, and that again I think has an impact on other parts of the world.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and it does show the difference between the geologists' search for a golden spike versus the kind of different ways that we understand this, looking at, say, social formations in history. So I suppose if we were looking for a golden spike of capitalism, it would be like the Coca-Cola can and broiler chicken KFC layer around the world. So maybe we could find one. Yeah, so very briefly, the idea of the Capitalocene which has a few different variants, is the notion that we shouldn't talk about the Anthropocene because of this notion of the anthropos at the center of it presumes a kind of unified human subject that's responsible for this. And that's completely unfair and eradicates all sorts of socioeconomic historical inequalities. And instead, we should talk about the Capitalocene, because the real crux of these the environmental changes lies in the socioeconomic formation of capitalism, pioneered in Western Europe and then spread around via colonial capitalism. And that therefore, you know, the blame rests with capitalists. Some people favor then an emphasis on 1492, Columbus and so on. Some it is much more about Victorian, so-called fossil capitalists, but those guys hate each other. But so there's all sorts of internecine warfare, but that's the basic premise of the Capitalocene. From the point of view of a historian of India, I have a couple of reservations about this, whilst also broadly thinking that this question of socioeconomic formations, including capitalism, is a really important one. So the first is that this really is a reheating of a very old set of narratives. Some of these people very literally say, you know, this is a narrow clique of white British men at the barrel of a gun exporting the Anthropocene to the rest of the world, which I think is not true. Firstly, because it denies the agency of the rest of the world. And secondly, because we who've studied that rest of the world have known for a very long time that empire didn't go around gifting technologies at the frontier to to the colonized. So for example, you know, I work a lot on electricity. The British Raj did not in any meaningful way spread electricity systems in India. So I think this kind of colonial capitalism, climate change, all going on together is not necessarily true. Unfortunately, the kinds of social inequalities we might put as part of colonialism actually probably retarded the development of Asian societies, for example. So it is more complicated than being able to point at that bogeyman. But to very quickly answer this question then about how we should think about these socioeconomic systems, what kind of alternatives we should look at. I'm very struck by the fact that today, so there's this famous figure that circulates, the 20 companies that are most responsible for carbon emissions since 1965. Of those 20 companies, 12 are state-owned and headquartered outside the West, which to me is very telling. Now, I think they are arguably capitalist. They're prioritizing capital accumulation, but this is not your, you know, American style capitalism. It's not your British style Anglo capitalism. I think we need to take much more seriously then the role of state-led development and also the expectations of populations that those states rely on to keep them in power. You know, it's very striking that, say, the biggest fossil fuel consumer subsidies in the world are in countries like Iran. This is not then something that boils down quite so neatly to a story of Western capitalism. It is a little bit more complicated. It forces us to bring in, along with the capitalism story, tales of the state, tales of what Joanna mentioned before, kind of consumer-centered ideas as well, that, as we know, produce enormous inequalities. So I think we can, I think it's a straw man argument to say that the Anthropocene doesn't allow us to talk about these inequalities, that we can only talk about the human species. We can hold those two thoughts at once, but I do think we need to complicate the idea that this was all about, you know, Columbus or Rockefeller or Edison or something, and then everywhere else just fell into line with this set of patterns. Because only when we precisely understand how this has happened can we start to understand how we can transform it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think what one sees, though, is I think that what we're talking about when we look at the kind of the social dimension of the Anthropocene, that we talk about power structures and power distribution in various ways. And I know, Joanna, this is one of your concerns. So I want to kind of put that to you a little bit, and I think move now really more to the present, because also I'm mindful of time. So I'm wondering that when we look at the world today, and evidently I think the Anthropocene has this narrative where we take a much more grim version of the present. I think as opposed to this kind of Whiggish interpretation of history, that every change is a change for the better. I think we're now, with the Anthropocene in mind, kind of casting doubt on that. Have we really progressed in that way? But I'm wondering, when we look at the situation that we're in today, that these processes that we've talked about have led to, to what extent is power distribution a factor in this? When you talk about even a phenomenon like consumerism is not necessarily based on social equality. So where do you see the power structures that have enabled, that have sustained the situation that we're in now, where we impact on the Earth system in very negative, almost destructive ways?
Okay, so Liz was talking a little earlier about inertia in systems, and I'm assuming she means because also we have inertia within institutional systems, and we have all this institutional indifference to the Anthropocene concept and the sort of trajectory, like the sort of business as usual trajectory. But on the other hand, we have this great acceleration in the changes in Earth, in the challenges and the social challenges that are very much associated, like intertwined. And I'm not quite sure that the Capitalizine concept is as reductive, actually, as Liz has just presented, because I see it very much as something that exists with the Anthropocene concept. And the people that I know who, I'm sort of vaguely in discussion with Jason Moore, who's one of the main proponents. And to me, it seems as if he understands the Anthropocene has its space, but it can't be hegemonic. There needs to be other ways of understanding what we're doing, the situation that we're in, because the Anthropocene doesn't have the capacity to do something. What it does is it describes a situation rather than creating an analysis that will help us get out of the situation. And so I do see the Capitalizine concept as something that's emerged along with all kinds of environmental critiques of reductionism, exploitation, extraction, the whole legacy of Enlightenment modernity, and like the types of governance that we have, not only in America and in this country, a very ferocious neoliberal capitalism, but the extractive types of capitalism, they might not be capitalism per se, but it's there's a participation in the capitalist types of governance and the accumulation of capital. And so I do think it is an important critical concept that should exist along with others. And that is, for example, like we have the technosphere, and which I think is a really important, great concept, but there's other types of technospheres that we could have. It's not we could have different technology doing different things. The way that technology functions right now is because of a particular type of the way in which the logic around what technology gets developed, whose interest gets served, and that is a particular type of governance, which is basically the capitalist concept. And you know, all of that has to do with power structure and how, you know, the capitalism concept is very much one that is about the way in which those dynamics, that type of governance creates power. You know, it's logic. It's based on extraction from the earth and extraction from people. And so you have these polarizations of wealth, and like increasingly, like, you know, even more concentration of wealth. And then it seems that those types of dynamics, and also, you know, in my history, as like my attempts to make environmental projects happen, it's very often like, it's very difficult to get something off of the ground when there isn't the capital, you know, the earth doesn't pay for us to save it. Like, you know, it's actually things like renewable energy cost a lot of money. It's not, there are other ways to make more money. And so it is very much like a particular logic that generates like the Anthropocene conditions and the types of power imbalances that make it so difficult to address the Anthropocene, the problems of the Anthropocene.